Racist cop grabs black woman, not knowing she filed the covert dossier that will collapse his command chain. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, we return to the main character. Alyssa Carter stood near the front steps of the municipal building as the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass doors, casting long, pale streaks across the concrete. And to anyone passing by, she looked like just another woman waiting for an appointment, calm, quiet, and unremarkable. Yet beneath that still exterior was a mind measuring time, detail, and consequence with practiced precision. Because Alyssa had learned long ago that attention was power and silence could be a shield when used correctly. And inside the building, Officer Daniel Whitmore was ending his shift with the casual certainty of a man who believed the badge on his chest protected him from questions he never intended to answer. A man who moved through hallways assuming compliance would follow his presence. And when he stepped outside and noticed Alyssa lingering near the entrance, his expression tightened not from concern, but from habit, from a reflex built by years of unchecked authority. And he approached her with a tone that carried more assumption than inquiry, asking what she was doing there and why she hadn't moved along. And Alyssa turned to face him with steady eyes and a neutral expression, offering no challenge, no fear, no apology, which only unsettled him further, because he expected hesitation, expected her to shrink under his gaze. And when she didn't, he closed the distance and asserted control with a firm grip meant to remind her who he thought was in charge. An action so casual, too. Him had barely registered as a choice. And for a moment the world seemed to pause, traffic humming in the distance, a flag above them stirring in the breeze, while bystanders looked away, not wanting to be involved, and Alyssa did not pull back or raise her voice. She simply met his stare with a quiet resolve that felt out of place in that moment, because this was not her first encounter with men like Whitmore, and it would not be her last. And she understood something he did not, that power did not always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it arrived folded neatly into files, time-stamped and verified, waiting patiently for the right sequence of events to bring it to light. And as Whitmore spoke down to her, convinced he was correcting a problem before it grew, Alyssa listened. Not to his words, but to the familiar rhythm of entitlement beneath them. The same rhythm she had documented for months. The same pattern reflected in incident reports, witness statements, and internal memos that told a far larger story than this single moment on the steps. And while he believed this encounter would end the way all the others had, with him walking away unchallenged, Alyssa knew it was already part of a record that could not be erased. A small but necessary piece of a much larger picture that had been carefully assembled far from this building, reviewed by eyes that did not flinch at badges or titles. And when he finally released his grip and stepped back with a warning he assumed would be enough, Alyssa remained where she was, composed and silent, because she understood that the most effective responses were not immediate, that true accountability moved through systems, not tempers. And as Whitmore turned away, convinced he had asserted order, he never once considered that the woman he dismissed had already set in motion a process that would reach far beyond him, through offices and ranks he trusted, toward a reckoning he could not yet see coming. And Alyssa watched him go with the patience of someone who knew the truth did not need to chase anyone. It simply waited to be acknowledged. Alyssa Carter remained on the steps for a moment after Officer Daniel Whitmore disappeared back into the building, the glass doors swallowing him and restoring the quiet rhythm of the street. And she took a slow breath, not out of relief, but calculation, because moments like this were never isolated, they were data points. And as she walked away, she noted the time on her phone, without looking at the screen. 5:47 in the evening, traffic heavier than usual, security cameras active. A predictable pattern that made the city feel orderly on the surface. And she moved with purpose down the block, heels clicking softly against the sidewalk, passing parked sedans and a food truck packing up for the night. blending into the ordinary flow of commuters heading home. And to anyone watching, she was simply another resident leaving a government building after business hours, unaware that she was already replaying the encounter in her mind, matching it against dozens of others she had documented over the past year, each one similar in tone, in assumption, in outcome. And inside the precinct, Whitmore leaned against the counter near the duty desk, recounting the interaction with a dismissive laugh to another officer, framing it as routine, as nothing worth remembering. And that was exactly what made him dangerous, because men like him did not think in terms of consequences beyond the end of their shift. They thought in terms of control and habit, and those habits were precisely what Alyssa had learned to track, because patterns told stories that individual complaints never could. And as she reached her car and unlocked it, she placed her bag carefully on the passenger seat, a plain leather tote that held nothing remarkable at a glance, just a notebook, a phone charger, a folded jacket. But beneath those items was a slim envelope sealed and labeled only with a date, one of several identical envelopes that together formed a timeline Whitmore could not see. And she drove away from the building, merging onto a two-lane road that led toward a quieter part of the city, where offices closed early and streetlights flickered on one by one. And her thoughts shifted from the encounter itself to what it represented, another confirmation that the system protected its own until it was forced to confront itself. And that confrontation required patience more than anger, because anger burned quickly and left nothing useful behind, while patience collected evidence. And by the time she reached her apartment, a modest place on the third floor of a brick complex with narrow stairwells and mailboxes that rattled when closed, the moment on the steps already felt distant, filed away where it belonged, and she climbed the stairs without turning on the lights, moving through the familiar space with ease, setting her bag on the kitchen table and removing the envelope, placing it beside others arranged in neat order, each marked with times, names, and locations that on their own seemed harmless, but together mapped a chain of command that thrived on silence. And she stood there for a moment looking at them, not with satisfaction, but with resolve, because she understood the weight of what she was building, that when the truth surfaced, it would not just embarrass one officer. It would force an entire department to answer questions it had avoided for years. And back at the precinct, Whitmore clocked out and headed to the parking lot, confident the day had gone as expected, unaware that the brief interaction he had already forgotten was now part of a record that would not forget him. And as Alyssa poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table, she reviewed her notes from memory, cross-checking dates and details without writing a single word, knowing that timing mattered, that moves had to be made in the right order, and that the most effective justice was the kind that arrived quietly, documented, undeniable. As she allowed herself a small pause, not to celebrate, but to prepare, because this was only the beginning, and the system she was watching was already beginning to tighten around itself, unaware of how fragile it truly was. Alyssa Carter woke before sunrise, the city still wrapped in that quiet hour where streetlights hummed and the air felt briefly honest, and she moved through her apartment with measured routine, coffee brewing, curtains barely parted, the radio left off because silence helped her think, and as she sat at the small kitchen table, she reviewed the mental ledger she carried everywhere, names, dates, procedures, all aligned like pieces of a structure that only made sense when viewed from above. And the previous evening's encounters settled neatly into place, not as an emotional memory, but as confirmation, because Whitmore's behavior had followed the same predictable arc she had seen countless times: authority asserted without cause, dismissal without curiosity, confidence without accountability, and that confidence was what allowed systems like his to persist. And later that morning she arrived at a public records office across town, a building most people ignored unless they had paperwork to file or fees to dispute, and she blended easily into the line, holding a folder that appeared unremarkable, exchanging polite nods with clerks who had no reason to remember her face. And this was where her work truly lived, not in confrontation, but in patience, in understanding how information moved and where it stalled, because systems left trail for those willing to follow them. And as she completed her request and stepped back outside into the growing heat, the sun already climbing past 75 degrees, she allowed herself a brief glance at her phone. A message notification waiting, nothing urgent. Just a time change for a meeting later in the week, and she acknowledged it silently, because timing mattered more than speed. And back at the precinct, Whitmore arrived for his shift carrying coffee and casual certainty, greeting colleagues by first name, unaware that his name had appeared again that morning in a document he had never seen. And while he joked near the lockers, Alyssa drove across town to a public library where she spent the late morning seated near a window, appearing to read while observing, because public spaces revealed how comfortable people felt when they believed no one important was watching. And she noticed officers she recognized from previous notes passing by, exchanging looks that carried familiarity and unspoken agreement. And those looks mattered because they told her who trusted whom, who spoke freely around whom, and who had likely close ranks when questions were asked. And by early afternoon she returned home, placing the new document into its envelope and sliding it among the others, the stack, growing slowly but steadily. And she stood back, hands resting lightly on the table, not out of pride but awareness, because this was the moment many people lost focus, mistaking accumulation for completion. But Alyssa knew better, knew that exposure without structure led to chaos, and chaos allowed truth to be dismissed as noise, and she refused to let that happen. And as the day faded, she prepared for the next phase, reviewing schedules, identifying the pressure points where oversight met, resistance, and somewhere across the city Whitmore ended his shift once more, confident his world remained unchanged, unaware that the ground beneath it was already mapped, measured, and documented. And as Alyssa closed her notebook and turned off the lights, she felt no triumph, only resolve, because the story she was assembling was not about her. It was about accountability, and when it finally surfaced, it would speak for itself, leaving no room for denial, no need for raised voices, only the quiet force of facts arranged in the order they had always deserved. Alyssa Carter's name surfaced again later that week, this time in a context that felt intentionally small, a routine inquiry log by the precinct that framed her as a procedural inconvenience rather than a person. And that framing mattered because it revealed how easily systems minimized what they did not understand. And she noticed it when a polite but pointed voicemail appeared on her phone requesting that she clarify her presence near the municipal building days earlier. The message, measured, almost friendly, yet carrying the subtle implication that she had crossed an invisible line. And Alyssa listened once, then deleted it without response, not out of defiance but strategy, because she understood escalation rarely announced itself loudly. It crept in through paperwork, through tone, through the suggestion that compliance was expected, and inside the precinct officer Daniel Whitmore felt that same escalation differently, as reassurance, because to him the inquiry was proof that the system was functioning as designed, filtering out disruptions, reinforcing hierarchy. And when he mentioned Alyssa's name during a briefing, it was with a shrug and a dismissive comment that framed her as someone seeking attention, and the room reacted as he expected, with nods and quiet agreement, no one asking why her name kept appearing, no one questioning whether patterns meant something more. And that collective dismissal was exactly what Alyssa had anticipated, because institutions rarely investigated themselves until pressure arrived from outside. And she spent that afternoon at a downtown cafe, seated near the window with a notebook open, appearing to write while listening to the low hum of conversation around her, because public spaces revealed attitudes people never documented, and she overheard fragments of discussion about internal transfers, about budgets tightening, about an upcoming audit that was being treated as routine, and that word routine caught her attention, because audits were only routine when people believed there was nothing to find. And as the day wore on, she received another message, this one from an unfamiliar number, requesting a meeting to clear up misunderstandings, the phrasing careful, almost courteous, and she allowed it to sit unanswered, because timing mattered more than courtesy. And she returned home as the sky shifted toward evening, the temperature cooling slightly, placing her bag on the table and reviewing her materials. Once more, aligning dates with departmental memos that revealed subtle discrepancies, small enough to ignore individually, significant when placed side by side, and she added a note to her mental ledger. Not written, not recorded digitally, just acknowledged, because some details were safer kept only in memory until the moment they were needed. And across town, Whitmore ended his shift feeling a faint irritation he could not name, a sense that something was not closing the way it should. That a loose thread remained, and he compensated for that feeling by leaning harder into certainty, asserting his authority more sharply in minor interactions, mistaking control for clarity, and Alyssa recognized that pattern too, because escalation always provoked overconfidence before collapse. And as night settled, she stood by her window, watching headlights pass below, the city moving forward unaware of the careful structure being assembled beneath its routines, and she felt no rush, no anxiety. Only the steady awareness that the next phase would bring resistance, subtle at first, framed as professionalism, as procedure, as concern, and she was prepared for it, because she had not entered this process to be liked or believed immediately. She had entered it to be precise, and precision did not require approval, only patience, and somewhere between the quiet of her apartment and the fluorescent lights of the precinct, the distance between assumption and accountability continued to narrow, unseen, unavoidable, and entirely of Whitmore's own making. Alyssa Carter noticed the shift not because anyone announced it, but because the silence around her work changed texture, the way air feels heavier before a storm, and it happened on an otherwise ordinary morning when she checked her email and saw a routine confirmation that should not have arrived yet, a receipt stamped with a reference number she had memorized months ago, indicating that a document had moved from pending to reviewed, and she did not smile or react outwardly because progress was never celebrated early. It was simply acknowledged and placed where it belonged, and she went about her day, as usual, grocery shopping, returning library books, exchanging polite words with neighbors who knew nothing of the quiet architecture being built behind her calm expression. And inside the precinct, Officer Daniel Whitmore felt a different version of that shift, subtle and unsettling, because processes he had always taken for granted began to slow, requests that once passed through automatically now returned with questions attached, not accusations, just clarifications, the kind that implied oversight rather than trust, and he dismissed it at first, telling himself it was bureaucratic noise, the inevitable friction of a system that touched too many hands, and that confidence carried him through the day, through roll call, through paperwork, through conversations where he continued to frame Alyssa as an anomaly, someone creating inconvenience without consequence. And Alyssa spent that afternoon reviewing a public schedule posted quietly on a government website, noting the names attached to an upcoming review panel, cross-referencing them with her records, identifying alignments that confirmed what she had suspected, that the command chain Whitmore relied on was more fragile than it appeared, dependent on mutual protection rather than transparency. And she marked that realization not on paper, but in timing, adjusting her internal calendar, because the order in which truths surfaced would determine how they were received. And as evening approached, she attended a community meeting held in a modest recreation center, sitting in the back, listening, because these gatherings revealed how official narratives filtered down to the people they affected, and she heard familiar phrases repeated with confidence, assurances that accountability existed, that safeguards were in place. And she recognized those phrases from reports she had already archived, words recycled to maintain calm rather than address cause. And back at the precinct, Whitmore encountered a minor delay that irritated him more than it should have, a supervisor asking him to resubmit a form he had completed dozens of times before, and he complied with visible impatience, unaware that the request itself was insignificant, but the record it created was not. And Alyssa returned home later that night and added another envelope to the table, this one thinner, containing a single page that by itself seemed harmless, yet when placed beside the others completed a sequence that could no longer be ignored, and she stood there longer than usual, considering not whether she should proceed, but how the system would react when it realized it could not quietly absorb what was coming. Because exposure did not always produce immediate change. Sometimes it produced resistance, defensiveness, attempts to redirect attention. and she prepared for that by refining her notes, ensuring every detail could stand alone if necessary. And Whitmore drove home, feeling the faint pressure of something unresolved, replaying interactions in his mind, not because he sensed guilt, but because control felt less certain, and he compensated the only way he knew how, by reinforcing routine, trusting familiarity to steady him, unaware that routine was exactly what allowed patterns to be seen. And as Alyssa turned off the lights and the city settled in a night, she felt the process advancing beyond her direct influence, moving through channels she had set in motion long ago. And she accepted that distance calmly, because the strongest cases were never driven by emotion. They were carried by consistency, and the structure she had built was now solid enough to stand without her presence, waiting for the moment when the system would be forced to confront itself not with outrage, but with evidence arranged too carefully to dismiss. The first formal request arrived on a Monday morning, delivered with neutral language and official formatting, inviting Alyssa Carter to provide clarification regarding several entries tied to her previous filings, and she read it once before setting the phone down. Not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed the sequence was unfolding as expected, and she prepared a simple response acknowledging receipt without elaboration, because restraint was as important now as precision. And across the city, Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the pressure sharpen into something he could no longer dismiss as inconvenience, because the questions were no longer abstract. They referenced dates, badge numbers, supervisory approvals, and procedures he had always assumed were shielded by hierarchy. And he found himself rereading emails, searching for reassurance in familiar signatures that suddenly felt less protective. And Alyssa spent that day moving deliberately through her routine, attending a scheduled appointment at a government office where she was greeted by someone who addressed her by full name and title for the first time, a subtle shift that signaled recognition without explanation, and she noted it internally, because recognition changed dynamics. And later that afternoon, she sat in a quiet conference room with a neutral backdrop and a digital recorder placed between her and an unseen audience, and she spoke calmly, answering questions fully without embellishment, because her strength had never been performance. It was consistency, and as she referenced documents, she did so without accusation, allowing the facts to establish their own gravity. And miles away, Whitmore received notice that a routine audit had expanded in scope, a phrase that carried no emotion but altered his posture instantly, because expanded meant external eyes, and external eyes meant narratives he could not control. And he attempted to reassure himself by reaching out to familiar contacts, only to find responses delayed, measured, cautious, and that caution unsettled him more than confrontation would have, because it suggested alignment was shifting quietly. And Alyssa concluded her meeting without ceremony, leaving the building as she always did, unnoticed by most. But the materials she had provided did not leave with her. They moved forward through channels designed for exactly this purpose. And she returned home that evening and rearranged the envelopes on her table, not adding new ones, but grouping them differently, because the story they told had reached a point where sequence mattered more than volume. And Whitmore drove home that night in silence, the radio off, replaying recent weeks with growing unease, because the system he trusted felt less predictable, and predictability had always been his anchor. And the next morning brought confirmation of what he feared, a notice requesting his presence at a review session framed as procedural, non-disciplinary, cooperative, and the language was so carefully neutral it stripped away the comfort of certainty. And Alyssa read a parallel update that morning, concise and formal, indicating the next phase would proceed as scheduled, and she acknowledged it with the same restraint she had practiced throughout, because she understood the work now belonged to the process, not to her. And as days passed, the precinct atmosphere shifted, conversations lowering, routines tightening, and Whitmore noticed colleagues measuring their words around him, not out of hostility, but self-preservation. And that realization landed heavily, because isolation revealed vulnerability more clearly than accusation ever could. And Alyssa continued her life without visible change, shopping, walking, exchanging, pleasantries because justice did not require her to disappear or dramatize her role. It required her to remain exactly who she had been, steady, attentive, precise. And as the review date approached, she felt no anticipation, only readiness. Because the most powerful moments were rarely loud. They unfolded quietly, documented, irreversible, and somewhere between official notices and unreturned calls. The distance between assumption and accountability narrowed to a point Whitmore could finally feel, even if he still did not fully understand it. And Alyssa knew that understanding would arrive in its own time, delivered not by confrontation, but by process, exactly as it should. The review session took place in a conference room that looked intentionally ordinary. Neutral walls, a long table, sealed folders placed at measured distances, and Officer Daniel Whitmore entered believing he could still navigate it with confidence. Because he had spent his career mastering rooms like this, speaking just enough, conceding nothing. And he took his seat with a practiced calm that hid the tension tightening behind his eyes. And moments later, Alyssa Carter was introduced not as a witness or a complainant, but by a designation that shifted the temperature of the room instantly. Her role stated clearly, formally, without emphasis. And Whitmore felt the first true fracture in his certainty as he realized the woman he had dismissed on the steps weeks earlier was not there by chance. And Alyssa acknowledged the room with a quiet nod, her demeanor unchanged, because authority did not require volume. And as the session began, documents were referenced methodically, timelines aligned, decisions traced through layers of approval that revealed how routine behavior became systemic practice. And Whitmore listened as familiar incidents were reframed not as isolated events, but as patterns, his name appearing not as the center, but as a link in a chain that extended above and below him. And the realization settled slowly, because the structure he trusted was now being examined from the outside. And Alyssa spoke only when asked, answering with precision, citing dates and sources without emotion, because emotion was unnecessary when the record spoke clearly. And Whitmore attempted to interject, to contextualize, to minimize, but each attempt was met with another document, another confirmation, another quiet acknowledgement that the process was already far beyond individual defense. And the moment of recognition arrived without drama. When a senior official referenced the dossier by its internal designation and credited Alyssa with its submission months earlier. And Whitmore understood then that the encounter he had forgotten was never about control in that moment. It was about exposure over time, and the room did not react with shock or outrage. It reacted with focus because this was not a confrontation. It was an evaluation, and Alyssa remained composed as the implications unfolded. Because she had never sought to collapse a person, she had sought to correct a system. And systems corrected themselves only when shown their own reflection. And Whitmore felt the weight of that reflection. As questions shifted away from him toward the decisions that had enabled him, supervisors who had signed off, processes that had failed to intervene, and he recognized too late that the protection he relied on depended on silence. And silence had already been broken by documentation he could not dispute. And as the session concluded, the officials outlined next steps in measured language, administrative, procedural, inevitable. And Alyssa gathered her materials without ceremony because her role was complete. And she exited the building into the afternoon light, feeling neither victory nor relief, only the quiet certainty that the work had held. And behind her, Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the truth that authority without accountability was temporary, and that the woman he underestimated had never needed to confront him directly to change his trajectory. And as Alyssa walked down the steps, the same steps where weeks earlier she had been treated as insignificant, she blended once again into the rhythm of the city, because justice, when done correctly, did not announce itself. It simply moved forward, leaving systems altered and assumptions dismantled, and the command chain Whitmore trusted began to unravel not through force or spectacle, but through the steady, undeniable presence of facts placed exactly where they belonged. In the weeks that followed the review session, the changes arrived quietly, wrapped in official language and procedural notices that traveled through inboxes and bulletin boards without fanfare. And Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the weight of them immediately as his access was adjusted, his schedule altered, his name removed from assignments he had long assumed were permanent. And no one needed to explain what it meant, because the system spoke clearly through omission, and he reported each morning to the same building, yet moved through it differently. Conversations shortening, familiar gestures replaced by careful distance. And he realized that accountability did not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrived as isolation, and Alyssa Carter watched these developments from a deliberate distance, not tracking individuals, but outcomes. Because the purpose had never been to observe a fall, but to ensure correction, and she received periodic updates framed as progress reports. Concise and factual, outlining structural adjustments, supervisory reviews, and policy revisions that addressed the patterns she had documented, and she read them with the same calm focus she had maintained throughout, because success was measured not in reaction, but in durability. And Whitmore attempted to regain footing by relying on routine, arriving early, completing tasks precisely, but routine could not restore trust once the record had spoken, and he understood now that authority was not taken away suddenly. It thinned gradually, until what remained was procedural presence without influence, and Alyssa spent her days returning to normal rhythms, walking familiar routes, attending ordinary appointments, because her work required her to remain unremarkable, and that normalcy was intentional, a reminder that accountability did not require spectacle. It required consistency, and inside the department meetings were held that Whitmore did not attend, discussions reframed around oversight and documentation rather than assumption, and language shifted subtly from protection to prevention, and those shifts mattered more than headlines, because they indicated learning rather than defense. And Alyssa received a final confirmation one afternoon, brief and definitive, stating that the process she initiated had concluded its primary phase and would transition into long-term monitoring. And she acknowledged it without response beyond receipt, because acknowledgement was enough, and Whitmore learned of the conclusion indirectly, through changes that solidified rather than reversed, his role defined more narrowly, his decisions reviewed more carefully, and he recognized that the command chain he trusted had not defended him, because it could not defend itself once examined. And that realization settled into something quieter than anger, a recognition that systems rewarded what they tolerated, and his behavior had been tolerated until it was documented. And Alyssa did not revisit the municipal steps where it began, because beginnings did not require revisiting once outcomes were secured, and she focused instead on what followed, the subtle but real recalibration of power that occurred when truth was allowed to move, unimpeded. And she understood that not every change would be visible immediately. Some would take years, some would be resisted, some would fail, but the structure now existed to address them. And that was enough. And as the city continued its routines, commuters passing buildings without noticing the quiet revisions inside, Alyssa remained what she had always been, attentive, measured, present. And Whitmore continued his duties under a different understanding of consequence, because the absence of spectacle did not diminish the impact. It clarified it. And the system moved forward, altered not by outrage or force, but by the steady application of evidence. And that quiet outcome carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. The story did not end with announcements or headlines. It ended the way most real change does, quietly, measured in absence rather than noise. And Alyssa Carter noticed it on an ordinary morning when she passed the municipal building without pausing, the steps unchanged, the glass doors reflecting the sky, just as they always had. And yet the atmosphere felt different, not lighter, but steadier, as if something unstable had finally been corrected. And she continued down the block without looking back, because her work had never been about claiming moments. It had been about restoring balance. And across the city, Officer Daniel Whitmore adjusted to a new reality defined not by confrontation, but by limits, his authority narrower, his decisions documented, his assumptions no longer reinforced by silence. And he began to understand that the power he once relied on had always been conditional, dependent on systems remaining unquestioned, and once questioned, that power dissolved into responsibility. And Alyssa returned fully to her routine, attending meetings unrelated to the case, focusing on work that required the same discipline but carried no personal weight because she had never defined herself by a single outcome, and she recognized that the true measure of success was sustainability, not satisfaction. And she received a final archival notice confirming the dossier had been formally integrated into long-term oversight protocols, a single sentence that carried years of implication, and she acknowledged it with the same restraint she had shown from the beginning. Because restraint was not hesitation, it was respect for process, and Whitmore observed changes ripple outward, supervisors more cautious, policies clearer, conversations shifting from loyalty to accountability, and though he felt diminished, he also felt something unfamiliar, awareness, because the system no longer allowed him to hide behind assumption, and that awareness, uncomfortable as it was, marked the difference between unchecked authority and responsibility. And Alyssa reflected briefly on the path that led here, not with pride but clarity, understanding that the moment on the steps had never been about her dignity alone. It had been about revealing how easily dignity could be dismissed when power went unexamined. And by examining it, she had not attacked individuals. She had illuminated structure. And illumination changed behavior more effectively than accusation ever could. And as seasons shifted and routines resumed, the city continued as it always did, people commuting, buildings opening and closing, unaware of the quiet corrections beneath their daily lives. And Alyssa remained part of that rhythm, present but unremarkable, because justice did not require her to be seen, only to be done. And Whitmore continued his career under a different understanding of consequence, no longer insulated by certainty, forced instead to operate within boundaries he once ignored. And that adjustment, though unwelcome, represented the very accountability the system had claimed to uphold. And in that outcome, there was no spectacle, no final confrontation, only the steady confirmation that truth, when documented patiently and applied precisely, reshaped power without raising its voice. And Alyssa walked forward carrying nothing but her composure, because she had never needed to carry the weight of the system she corrected. She had simply held up a mirror and allowed it to respond. And that quiet resolution echoed far beyond one officer or one building, proving that justice did not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrived with files, time, and the courage to let facts speak until they could no longer be ignored.